Big Joel is a breadtuber whose loaf is cut a higher quality than average. Most breadtubers like to spam out videos about how Steven Crowder, Sargon of Akkad, or other bigger YouTube channels are horrible racists. Big Joel is at least capable of talking about subjects other than how woke he is all of the time. That doesn't mean his ideas are correct though. I wanted to talk about Big Joel's review of the TV show The Good Place. Now, I haven't myself watched this show. I pretty rarely watch any TV shows, and this show just sounds unappealing. I did read a summary of its plot and setting though for the purpose of making this video. The weird premise of this show focuses on humans in the afterlife. The afterlife in the show shares a little bit in common with the Christian version of the afterlife. In the show, they use an algorithm that considers the morality of decisions that people have made in their lives in order to sort them into heaven or hell. Those who make it into heaven enjoy eternal happiness. Those who end up in hell are made to suffer.
Chidi doesn't really feel this way, not even in the moment he's saying it. Chidi is extremely invested in the moral philosophy that people come up with. He wants to work on his thesis. His big thing is teaching Eleanor ethics.
Who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Plato.
And yet, here, he seems to be throwing all that away.
It has been proven by an infallible formula.
He just said that the good place, the point system it uses, and presumably the consequences of that system, works through an objective, infallible morality.
When your time on Earth has ended, we calculate the total value of your life using our perfectly accurate measuring system. Only the people with the very highest scores, the true cream of the crop, get to come here, to the good place.
And if he really believed that, then why would he ever talk about Kant or Plato or any of those bros? If he wanted to learn about ethics, why wouldn't he just look at the big list of cosmic rules rather than at his own silly mind? Why would he ever feel morally conflicted ever again?
Joel is conflating normative ethics with the made-up meta-ethics of the show. To explain to Joel why Chidi would still care about moral philosophy, you have to understand how the heaven depicted in the show departs from a biblical interpretation of heaven. Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe in a God who is omniscient and infallible. That means that he knows everything and is never wrong. In the show, the algorithm that sorts people into their respective place was not created by an infallible, omniscient God. It was instead created by unspecified creators. Furthermore, the algorithmic sorting is maintained by a bureaucracy of demons, angels, and dead humans. This bureaucracy is able to make changes to it. This sort of thing would not be possible in a biblical heaven where God rules as an omnipotent king who is always right. The show's entire plot is based around the idea that characters continue to learn more about normative ethics until they are able to persuade this bureaucracy that it ought to reform how people are sorted. In other words, the show is a progressive power fantasy. As a breadtuber, I'm surprised that Joel didn't like it. Chidi, as a professor of ethics and moral philosophy, would be the exact type of person who would want to try and reconcile the moral philosophy of humans with the ethical sorting system that exists in the afterlife.
I think the reason why I love this scene so much is that it brings to mind an ethical dilemma that Chidi has to face, one that's never explicitly talked about in the show. Because there are really only two things he can believe about this situation, and neither of them are pretty. The first option, option A, is that he can think the good place represents objective morality. What they say is what is right. But if he thinks that, he has to accept a whole lot of what might seem like nonsense to him. Why is it objectively moral that only the cream of the crop should go to the good place while other people, like Eleanor, should suffer in the bad one?
This is the same conflation of meta-ethics with normative ethics. I can appreciate that many would consider a bifurcated heaven and hell to be a hard thing to justify morally. Aren't there people who would walk the line between the two? Does it make sense for Homer Simpson and Hitler to suffer the same fate? Catholics get around this problem through their belief in a purgatory. This is a place where people in between can go and eventually redeem themselves by making it into heaven. This is one of the reforms that the protagonist eventually create in order to solve the problem of the afterlife in the show. Now, if the afterlife were created by a biblical god, then this would create a problem. The biblical god cannot be wrong. However, the premise of this show is that there is no biblical god. That means that Chidi can believe it's possible that the normative ethics of the good place are possibly true, despite an apparent problem with its meta-ethics.
How is it possible that everything he believes about morals can all be boiled down to a list of extremely absolutist laws that don't really follow a coherent logic?
For example, a couple in Osaka, Japan just decided to have a destination wedding, negative 1,200 points. Oh, and it's a destination theme wedding, negative 4,300.
If the good place has all the moral answers, then morality kinda sucks. So, okay, maybe Chidi rejects that idea and instead picks option B, that the good place doesn't represent objective morality. Real morality is what humans have come up with, and this place is just some strange bastardization of that. Well, that's great, but in that case, the entire universe is an arbitrary wasteland, totally unresponsive to real ethics.
Well, first of all, I didn't even watch the show, but I somehow know the answer to this question while Joel seems mystified. The algorithm that sorts people is not ethically correct. It's flawed for a variety of reasons that the show demonstrates through its characters dealing with moral problems. This is the entire premise of the show. The fact that the algorithm was not correct, though, doesn't mean we have to automatically accept moral nihilism. After all, it was through a greater understanding of ethics and morality that the show's protagonist eventually succeeded in changing the way things worked.
Chidi doesn't quite pick a side. Most of the time, he seems to agree with option B. As I already said, he loves studying human philosophy. He thinks it's the way to become a better person. In a particularly telling scene in the second season, Michael starts explaining the morality of actions in terms of the point system.
I know for a fact that if you steal a loaf of bread, it's a negative 17 points.
And Chidi flatly tells him, I just know more ethics than you.
When it comes to human ethics, I just know more than you.
A clear suggestion that he doesn't put much stock in this point system. And yet, he's never fully willing to accept the implications of option B, except that the universe really isn't governed by any kind of ethical law that would be meaningful to him. From Chidi's perspective, whatever failings this afterlife might have must be a glitch in the system. Sure, the afterlife is pretty immoral, pretty imperfect, but, you know, it doesn't want to be bad. It's just that somewhere along the line, mistakes were made. They're not accounting for how complicated the world is, how difficult it is to be a good person these days. That's why they keep torturing people.
Your Honor, life now is so complicated. It's impossible for anyone to be good enough for the good place.
And if they understood the problem, they'd want to change things for the better. Chidi has no real reason to think this, but he does.
Joel is absolutely melting my brain here. So let's break this down. Number 1. The algorithm that sorts people into heaven and hell is flawed. Big Joel agrees with this and has explained why he finds it flawed earlier in the video. Number 2. The bureaucracy tells everyone in heaven and hell that the algorithm is correct. However, there is no evidence presented that this is true, and in the end it turns out to be completely false. Number 3. Chidi, a professor of morality familiar with the philosophy of Aristotle, is able to see that the algorithm is a flawed method of calculating human morality. Number 4. This somehow strikes Big Joel as an inconsistency, but it isn't.
No one is beyond rehabilitation.
First of all, I find the argument here completely unsatisfying. The case has 2 steps. Premise, people can get better. Conclusion, therefore the afterlife should help them get better and not torture them. But is that really the best we can do? Does it get at the crux of why torturing people is wrong? I don't think so. From my perspective at least, it seems like the reason these cosmic deities shouldn't torture people is pretty similar to the reason that you shouldn't torture people. Because torturing is wrong on the face of it. It's bad, actually, to cause needless, eternal suffering to someone else.
I've got a newsflash, everyone. I know it's going to be shocking to hear me say this, but Big Joel just turned ethics into property rights. To progressives and libertarians, morality is inherent in a given act. The bureaucracy shouldn't torture people because torture is immoral. As a conservative, I recognize that this is bullshit. Morality comes ultimately from the content of the person's character. Now, one's actions are usually a good indicator of one's character, but it's far more complicated than just this. Murder is wrong, but is it wrong for a soldier to kill an enemy soldier on the front line? If the murder was conducted in such a way that most soldiers would recognize it as a virtuous killing in accordance with warfare, then no. If the enemy soldier was trying to surrender and wasn't a threat, then yes. Are there some acts we can agree are wrong in any context? Let's use the example of an adult having sex with a child. Most people, myself included, agree that a bright line age of consent law is necessary on this issue. There is never a good reason for an adult to have sex with a child. That being said, consider this silly counterexample. What if a terrorist has placed a nuclear bomb in the center of New York City? You have no way to stop him from blowing it up. Now assume that he threatens to blow up the nuclear bomb unless you have sex with the child. I guess this terrorist is from NAMBLA or something. Assuming you have good moral character, you should find this example to be gross and revolting. However, assuming you followed through with the demand of the terrorist doesn't make you a bad person. Now, Joel brings up the issue of torture. In America, some types of torture are allowed while other types are not. My position on torture is that no bullshit Middle Eastern forever war is worth torturing anyone over. That's regardless of the method used. Now, if China nukes the United States and commences a land invasion, I will defer to the military authorities to decide what tactics are appropriate.
With enough chances, people will eventually make enough good choices to qualify for the good place. And maybe some never will, but that's okay because everyone gets a fair shot.
And this leads me to my more important point, at least in terms of this video. How could Chidi's argument possibly persuade the people who he's talking to? Like, this judge lady, she's already signed on to this ridiculous belief that when people do bad things, they deserve to be tortured forever.
Pull out some fingernails, toss someone in an acid pit, fire up the old penis flattener.
Butthole spiders.
Huh? There is no reasonable justification for that belief. No ethical system we could come up with that would lead to that conclusion.
I don't see why something like the biblical conception of hell couldn't be ethical. Let me explain why. Number 1. When people die, they leave their bodies and all their possessions behind. All that is left is the soul that either ascends to heaven or descends to hell. Number 2. It's therefore impossible to view the ethics of hell through a prism of ethics as property rights. Whether you end up going to heaven or you end up going to hell, you will no longer own any property or have a body. Number 3. In cartoons, hell is a place where people are subjected to repeated violent torture. But people without bodies cannot be tortured. Instead, hell is a place of suffering of the soul, while heaven is a place of happiness of the soul. Number 4. What it means for a soul to suffer or to be happy is incomprehensible to us as living things. We've never experienced what it's like to be just a soul. It's not even clear if we would still be conscious or have thoughts at that point. Therefore, it's hard for us to pass moral judgments on such a condition. Number 5. To ethically evaluate hell, you also have to have some sort of underlying theory of divine providence. You need a theory of why God has separated hell, heaven, and earth. Without any theory on this, you cannot make any ethical judgment about it because you don't know its purpose. Number 6. The fact that virtue leads to the greatest satisfaction in one's own life is not hidden information. Philosophers as old as Buddha and Aristotle knew this. The Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims knew this. It's been scientifically validated by moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, so it exists in science as well. Number 7. To avoid the path of virtue is to ignore wisdom that has existed for centuries in our own human biology, in which virtue ethics has been encoded through evolution. It wouldn't be God's fault if people chose to ignore these things.
I don't quite buy that Chidi's argument would convince her of anything. Alright, she might respond, people maybe get better after they die, but when did that suddenly become a thing I care about? I know people change, they do it all the time on Earth, but that fact has never convinced me to not torture them in the past.
I kind of agree with Joel here. The progressive message of the show is pretty stupid. In The Good Place, dying is more like being reborn. You get your body back. You feel pleasure and pain again. You can learn new things and do most of the things that you could already do on Earth. That means you can change your personality, learn about morality, and make adjustments to yourself. It's hard to imagine that the bureaucracy is so stupid that they don't realize this.
And in the end, none of these deities really do change their minds in a way that really counts. The way the plot resolves has nothing to do with any kind of moral claim. While the judge realizes that the afterlife doesn't work anymore, that doesn't cause her to, want to make it better. She's more than willing to murder every single person in existence before everyone agrees on a solution, and she's like, fine, let's just do that.
In terms of how we handle this moving forward, obviously, Earth is canceled. All humans on Earth and in the afterlife will be extinguished, and we will start the entire human race over from scratch.
The head demon, Sean, caves for unrelated reasons, because he's bored of the status quo or something.
You corkscrew your first eyeball and you're like, man, I can't believe they're paying me to do this. By the trillionth, it's like, I should have just been a teacher.
So, Chidi's argument just kinda sits there, like a wet fart. This statement that people can get better looks important and powerful and thematically resonant, but within the show, its logic, its mechanics, it doesn't accomplish anything. There's no real reason why it works.
Joel, I know this might be a hard pill for you to swallow, but there is progressive left-wing bias in the mainstream media. TV shows and movies make decisions to push political agendas that interfere with the quality of their storytelling. Sometimes this insertion of propaganda that conflicts with the plot of the show or the movie makes no sense and just leaves people confused. Now, is there any group of people being punished for bad things that they did that the progressives may want to argue have changed and deserve reconsideration? Is there any group that exists that may fit this criteria? Could the writers of the show be making an exaggerated caricature of people that they don't like in order to make them seem stupid and evil? In fact, there may be reasons why they would want the antagonist to side with the protagonist, not for the moral arguments which are directed at the audience, but for selfish, pragmatic reasons. Anyways, we're at the end of the video here, so let me give you my ultimate takeaway from all of this. Big Joel doesn't understand ethics. He seems to keep conflating normative ethics with meta-ethics. He also conflates the bizarre plot of the show with the biblical conception of heaven and hell. In reality, the show depicts a straw man version of heaven and hell in order to push a progressive message. Big Joel fails to understand this and instead critiques the show for not being more hostile to its fictional religious authority. However, this show could never be a serious critique of religion because it's such a strange reinterpretation of it. For example, instead of God ruling the kingdom of heaven, in the show there is no God and it's run instead by an incompetent bureaucracy. But that's about all I've got to say in response to Big Joel's video. If you enjoyed this video and you're not subscribed to my channel, please support small YouTube channels like mine by subscribing. Thanks.